What life was like without technology in the Middle Ages. Stop for a moment and think about your morning today. You probably woke up to an alarm on your phone. You checked your messages. You turned on a light with the flick of a switch. You walked to your bathroom, turned a handle, and clean hot water poured over your body. You opened your refrigerator and picked from dozens of options for breakfast. You got into a car or a bus and traveled miles in minutes. Every single one of those actions would have been impossible, unimaginable, absolutely inconceivable to the people who lived during the Middle Ages. And we are not talking about a small group of people. We are talking about centuries of human civilization, hundreds of millions of lives lived without a single piece of the technology you take for granted every single day. What life was like without technology in the Middle Ages is not just a history lesson. It is a mirror. And when you look into it, you will never see your own life the same way again. Let us begin in a place that most of us know nothing about. A small farming village in the English countryside, somewhere around the year 1210. The village has no name that appears on any map because maps barely exist, and this place is too small for anyone of importance to care about. There are roughly 40 families living here, all of them bound to the land owned by a lord who lives in a stone manor house on the hill. His name is Lord Godfrey, and to the people below, he is the law, the government, and the closest thing to a king they will ever see. Among those 40 families is a man named Thomas. He is 31 years old, though if you saw him you would guess he was 50. His skin is weathered and rough from years of working under the sun and the rain. His teeth are crooked and several are missing. His hands are thick with calluses, and his fingers are permanently curved from gripping tools since he was old enough to walk. Thomas is not unique. He is average. He represents the vast majority of people who ever lived during this period. He is a serf, which means he is not exactly a slave, but he is certainly not free. He cannot leave the village without permission. He cannot marry without the Lord's approval. He cannot sell his crops to anyone he chooses. His life, from the moment he was born to the moment he will be buried in the churchyard, belongs to this land and to the man who owns it. Thomas wakes before dawn every single day. There is no alarm clock. There is no clock at all. He wakes because his body has been trained by years of routine, and because the cold seeping through the walls of his home makes sleep impossible once the fire dies down. His house is a single room, roughly the size of a modern living room, built with wooden posts, wattle walls packed with mud, and a thatched roof that leaks when it rains. The floor is packed earth, covered with straw that is changed only a few times a year. There are no windows, or if there are, they are simply holes in the wall covered with wooden shutters or oiled cloth. Glass windows are a luxury that only churches and the wealthiest households possess. Inside this room, Thomas lives with his wife Agnes, their 3 children, and 2 goats. The goats are not pets. They are kept inside because their body heat helps warm the house during the freezing winter months, and because leaving them outside would risk losing them to thieves or wild animals. The smell inside this home is something no modern person could endure. Animal waste, wood smoke, sweat, and the sour odor of unwashed bodies all blend into a thick, permanent atmosphere that the family has long stopped noticing. Agnes is already awake, stirring a pot of pottage over the fire pit in the center of the room. Pottage is a thick soup made from whatever vegetables and grains are available. It is the same meal the family eats nearly every day, sometimes twice a day. The base is usually oats or barley, with onions, cabbage, peas, or beans added when they are in season. There is no salt because salt is expensive and must be purchased from traveling merchants who visit the village only a few times a year. There is no pepper, no sugar, no spices of any kind. Meat is almost never on the table. A chicken might be slaughtered for a feast day, and pork might appear once or twice a year, but for the most part, the family survives on bread and pottage. The bread itself is not like anything you have ever tasted. It is dark, dense, and often gritty, because the stones used to grind the grain leave tiny particles of rock in the flour, which slowly wear down the teeth of everyone who eats it. This is one of the reasons so many medieval people had severe dental problems by the time they reached adulthood. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because if real stories from history that change the way you see the world are something you value, this is the one channel you cannot afford to miss. Thomas finishes his portion of pottage and steps outside. The village is already stirring. Other men are heading to the fields, some carrying wooden tools, others leading oxen that will pull the heavy plows. Farming in the Middle Ages was backbreaking, inefficient, and completely dependent on the weather. There were no tractors. There were no irrigation systems. There was no weather forecast. A farmer planted his seeds and then prayed, literally prayed, that the rain would come at the right time, that the frost would not arrive too early, that the insects would not devour the crop before it could be harvested. The tools available were primitive by modern standards. Plows were made of wood with an iron tip, and they barely scratched the surface of heavy clay soil. It often took a team of 8 oxen to pull a single plow, and most families could not afford that many animals, so they shared with their neighbors and took turns working each other's strips of land. The fields were not fenced or organized in neat rows. They were divided into long, narrow strips under a system called open field farming, and each family was assigned several strips scattered across the village's farmland. This meant Thomas might have to walk a mile between one strip and another, wasting precious time and energy every single day. The work lasted from sunrise to sunset, with only a brief break in the middle of the day to eat more bread and drink ale. Yes, ale. Water in the Middle Ages was often unsafe to drink because there was no purification system, no treatment, no understanding of bacteria or contamination. Rivers and streams were used for everything: drinking, washing, dumping waste, and watering animals, all at the same time. The result was water that could make you seriously ill. So most people, including children, drank ale instead. It was weak, barely more than flavored water, but the brewing process made it safer than anything that came straight from the ground. Brewing was one of the most important skills a woman could have, and Agnes brewed the family's ale herself, using grain that could have otherwise been made into bread. Every decision was a trade-off. Every resource was precious. Now let us talk about what happened when someone got sick, because this is where the reality of medieval life becomes truly staggering. Thomas and Agnes's youngest child, a boy named Edmund, has been coughing for 3 weeks. The cough started small but has grown worse. He is pale. He has lost weight. He shivers even when wrapped in every piece of cloth the family owns. In the modern world, Agnes would take him to a doctor. He would be examined, diagnosed, and given medicine that would likely cure him within days. In 1210, none of that exists. There is no doctor in the village. The nearest physician lives in a town 20 miles away, and his services cost more than Thomas earns in a year. Even if they could afford it, the physician's knowledge is based on theories about bodily humors and the balance of fluids, treatments that have no scientific basis and often do more harm than good. The village has an herbalist, an old woman named Maud, who gathers plants from the forest and prepares remedies that have been passed down through generations. Some of these remedies work, not because of magic, but because certain plants do have genuine medicinal properties. But Maud cannot cure everything. She cannot perform surgery. She cannot treat infections. She cannot do anything about the diseases that sweep through the village every few years, leaving empty houses and fresh graves behind. Agnes sits beside Edmund at night, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead and whispering prayers. That is medieval health care. That is all there is. Death in the Middle Ages was not an abstract concept. It was a neighbor, a constant presence that walked alongside every person from the moment they were born. Roughly 1 out of every 3 children did not survive past the age of 5. Women faced enormous risks during childbirth, and many did not survive the experience. Men were killed or permanently injured by farming accidents, falling trees, kicks from horses, or the countless hazards of daily labor. A simple wound, a cut from a tool or a scrape from a fall, could become infected and lead to death within days. There were no antibiotics. There were no antiseptics. There was no understanding of how infections worked or how to prevent them. When the Great Pestilence arrived in 1348, it moved through Europe like a shadow, and the people had absolutely no way to fight it. They did not know it was carried by fleas on rats. They did not know about germs or contagion. Some believed it was a punishment from God. Others blamed outsiders and strangers. Villages that had thrived for generations were emptied in weeks. Bodies were buried in mass graves because there were not enough living people to dig individual ones. It is estimated that between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population perished during that period. Imagine losing half of everyone you know. That was the reality. But life was not only about survival and suffering. There was community. There was joy, however fragile. The village church was the center of social life, and the calendar was marked by religious festivals and feast days that gave people a reason to come together, to eat a little better than usual, to sing, to dance, to forget for a few hours the weight of their daily existence. Music was played on simple instruments, pipes, drums, and stringed instruments carved by hand. Stories were told around fires, passed from one generation to the next, tales of heroes and saints and monsters that lived in the dark forests beyond the fields. These stories were the only form of entertainment most people would ever know. There were no books for common people. There were no theaters. There was no art hanging on the walls of their mud houses. But there was imagination, and it was as vivid and powerful then as it is now. Children in the Middle Ages did not go to school. Education was reserved almost exclusively for the clergy and the sons of wealthy families. A peasant child learned by watching and doing. By the age of 5 or 6, boys were helping in the fields, carrying water, feeding animals, and gathering firewood. Girls learned to cook, brew ale, spin wool, and tend to the household. By the age of 12, most children were working full days alongside the adults. There was no concept of adolescence, no transition period between childhood and adult responsibility. You grew up fast or you did not grow up at all. Literacy was almost non-existent among the common population. Books were handwritten by monks in monasteries, each one taking months or even years to complete, and they were so valuable that they were sometimes chained to the desks where they were read. The idea that every person could own a book, let alone carry thousands of them in a small device in their pocket, would have been beyond the comprehension of anyone living in that era. If this is making you think about how much the world has changed, pause right now and leave a comment saying, "I would not survive a single week in the Middle Ages." I want to know what you think, and I want to know which modern comfort you would miss the most. Let us move beyond the village and talk about what the wider world looked like during this time. Travel was rare, dangerous, and painfully slow. Most peasants never ventured more than 10 or 15 miles from the place where they were born. The roads, if you could call them that, were unpaved dirt tracks that turned into rivers of mud during the rainy season and clouds of dust during the summer. There were no signs. There were no maps available to ordinary people. If you needed to travel, you relied on landmarks, the direction of the sun, and the advice of anyone you met along the way. Bandits were a real and constant threat on the roads, especially in forested areas where they could hide and ambush travelers. There was no police force. There was no emergency number to call. If you were robbed or harmed on the road, you were on your own. The journey from one town to another, a distance that might take 30 minutes by car today, could take 2 or 3 days on foot, and you had to carry everything you needed with you: food, water, and some form of protection. Inns existed in larger towns, but they were expensive, crowded, and often infested with pests. Many travelers simply slept under trees or in barns and hoped for the best. Trade did exist, but it was limited and slow. Goods moved by horse-drawn cart or by boat along rivers, and the cost of transporting anything over long distances was enormous. Spices from the East, silk from Asia, and fine metals from distant mines were available at markets and fairs, but their prices were so high that only the wealthiest could afford them. For ordinary people, everything they used was made locally: their clothes, their tools, their food, their furniture. A peasant family might own a cooking pot, a few wooden bowls, a knife, a set of farming tools, and the clothes on their backs. That was everything. The concept of shopping, of browsing goods and choosing what to buy, simply did not exist for most people. You made what you needed or you went without. The seasons ruled everything. Winter was the most feared time of year. The days were short, the nights were freezing, and food supplies dwindled rapidly. Families huddled together in their dark, smoky homes and waited for spring. Firewood was essential for survival, and gathering enough of it was a constant task. Even the forests were not free to use. The Lord owned the trees, and cutting wood without permission could result in punishment. People burned dried animal waste when they could not find wood. They wore every piece of clothing they owned, layering rough wool tunics and cloaks in an attempt to keep the cold at bay. Frostbite, pneumonia, and other cold-related illnesses claimed lives every winter, especially among the very young and the very old. Spring brought relief, but also the grueling work of plowing and planting. Summer was the busiest time, with long days of labor under the sun. Autumn was harvest season, a time of hope and anxiety in equal measure, because the size of the harvest determined whether the family would eat through the winter or face starvation. And through all of this, through the hunger and the cold and the sickness and the endless labor, people found ways to love. Thomas and Agnes did not choose each other in the way modern couples do. Their marriage was likely arranged, or at least strongly influenced, by their families and the needs of the community. But that does not mean there was no affection between them. In the quiet moments, after the children were asleep and the fire had burned low, they sat together and talked in whispers. They shared their fears and their small hopes. They argued and forgave. They held each other during the long winter nights and found comfort in the simple fact that they were not alone. Love in the Middle Ages was not about grand gestures or romantic ideals. It was about presence. It was about endurance. It was about choosing to face another impossible day together, because the alternative was facing it alone. Thomas would live to be 38 years old. By the standards of his time, that was a full life. He would see 2 of his 3 children survive to adulthood. Edmund, the youngest, the one who had been coughing, would not recover. He would pass quietly one winter night, with Agnes holding him and Thomas standing in the doorway, unable to speak. They would bury him in the churchyard next to Thomas's own mother, who had passed the year before. There would be no death certificate, no obituary, no record of Edmund's life at all, except in the memories of the people who loved him. And within a generation, even those memories would fade. That was the fate of almost every person who lived during the Middle Ages. They were born, they struggled, they loved, and they disappeared without a trace. No photographs, no journals, no social media posts, just silence. And yet here we are, 800 years later, telling their stories. Because even though their names are lost, their experiences are not. Every comfort you enjoy today, every piece of technology you hold in your hand, every medicine that keeps you healthy, every road you drive on, every book you read, every light you turn on when darkness falls, all of it was built on the foundation of their suffering and their perseverance. They did not know they were building a future. They were simply trying to survive the present. But survive they did. Generation after generation, century after century, pushing humanity forward one painful step at a time. The next time you complain about your phone being slow, or your food taking too long to arrive, or your house being a little too cold, remember Thomas. Remember Agnes. Remember Edmund. Remember the millions of nameless people who would have given anything, everything, for just one day of the life you live right now. History is not just a subject in school. It is the story of every sacrifice that was made so that you could exist in the world you know today. And the least we can do is remember. If this story moved you, if it made you see your life even a little differently, hit that like button right now and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Send it to a friend, send it to your family, because stories like this deserve to be heard by as many people as possible. If you watched all the way to this point, it is because something in this story stayed with you. Leave a comment right now saying, "I watched until the end," so I can get to know you and see who really connects with the stories on this channel. And if you are not yet subscribed, do it now and turn on notifications, because every single week we bring you real stories from history that will make you think, make you feel, and make you grateful for the world you live in. I will see you in the next one.